Google Drive to access if you would like it. So here's Elina Hamilton.
Thank you, Dawn. I also wanted to say thank you. I'm very sorry I was sick yesterday and I wasn't able to participate here in person, but I'd like to thank the technical team behind the scenes here for doing such a great job, because I got to see the whole conference from my bed yesterday. So thank you very much for the technical team. So let us suppose that a student cellist is preparing to perform Mendelssohn's Second Sonata, cello sonata. Because she is a curious and generally good student, she may notice that the sonata was composed in 1843. But unless she has taken a special seminar on Mendelssohn's career, she is unlikely to know that in 1843, Mendelssohn was in the middle of a very busy period of his life, or that in this year he founded a conservatory in Leipzig. Though she has noticed that the sonata is dedicated to a certain Count Wilhowski, the name does not immediately ring a bell, and so is dismissed. Unbeknownst to her, the dedication also plays an important role in the founding of an institution in St. Petersburg, and reveals that there was a musical connection between the two cities. But because she is a performer first and foremost, our cellist is really only interested in figuring out what her practicing strategy will be in the next few weeks, when she must master this piece. To her, the immediacy of the recital is far more important than what happened in Leipzig 174 years ago, especially because she has just found out that she has money to afford an accompanist, and is Facebook messaging to find out how he would like to be paid. My paper today addresses the issue that many music students are distant from the past, both through time and geography, when they learn the history of Western music. I will share how I dealt with this problem in my course, The Sounds of the Conservatories, which I designed as a graduate seminar for the Boston Conservatory master's students. As advertisements and notices that the Boston Conservatory was turning 150 piled into my inbox this past year, it seemed timely to offer a course on the history of music conservatories. The anniversary also came at a crucial moment in the history of the Boston Conservatory, as a seemingly unprecedented and brave merger between the Boston Conservatory and the Berklee College of Music took place last year. The merger challenged everyone, but offered a unique historical opportunity. In his essay, Changing the Stories We Tell, Peter Burkholder exhorts us to create new musical narratives based on the interests relevant to our students in the classroom. A problem I have encountered in my classes is that sometimes textbook stories seems to have little relevance to today's world. Because the merger and the anniversary were extremely relevant to my students at the Boston Conservatory in 2017, I set out to design a class to illustrate that they are a part of an ongoing history of musicians. But how do I narrow the gap between textbook stories and the realities of the 21st century? To structure the course, I set out 4 objectives. First, I decided it was important to begin with composers and institutions familiar to students who have studied Western music history. Because this course also serves as a review of previous knowledge gained in seminars on Western music, we began with the founding of modern conservatories established in Paris, Leipzig, and Russia, before taking a look around the world to seek out how, why, and when conservatories were founded. Time limitations required me to restrict to a selection of institutions, but you can find a brief outline of my syllabus in your first portion of your handout. I also have a fuller version of my syllabus on my academia.edu if you're really curious about the bibliography that goes along with this. Secondly, I attempted to provide a way to incorporate the perspective of a history which addressed some major current issues, especially those concerning the inclusion of gender and race in Western music history. My third objective was to look for ways that I could bring a localization process to everyone. Because the Boston Conservatory was a common ground for everyone in the class, this was initially an easy task. But I wanted to make sure that students from different regions, including my students from Asia, would be able to relate to some part of the history. Finally, I wanted to encourage my students to experience firsthand how their stories fit into the historical narrative by studying the history of their own institution. Although I began with the familiar names of Western music history, I know that for my students, European history actually feels quite distant. To compensate, I often begin my classes with a map of Europe, giving them an opportunity to understand the locations of musical events. I do this because I have found that many students struggle to find European locations. To them, Vienna seems to neighbor Paris. And while they may know where London is, they have a much harder time finding Leipzig. Sorry, that was meant to come in there. And that beachside vacation over spring break in St. Petersburg, Florida, is definitely more memorable to them than the much colder city in Russia. Maps visualize stories and make music history feel more realistic. When I teach that in 1841, Count Wilhowsky the dedicatee in Mendelssohn's cello sonata, founded Russia's first music society and invited composers such as Liszt, Berlioz, and the Schumanns to St. Petersburg for a number of important concerts. This connection to St. Petersburg may not be immediately obvious, but further probing into history reveals the significance. By 1843, the Gewandhaus Orchestra of Leipzig desperately needed to increase the number of musicians to meet their demanding performance schedule. The 34-year-old Mendelssohn took on the task at hand and, with funding from Frederick August II, established a conservatory. Mendelssohn had gathered some of the best musicians who could provide the best instruction in the Leipzig Conservatory. To instruct strings, the violinist Ferdinand David was hired. Pianists Robert and Clara Schumann provided instruction for keyboardists. The vocalist Henriette Brunot provided singing lessons. It was not long before the conservatory became the model for other institutions in Europe. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Nicholas I's policies had banned the establishment of new societies. This became a problem for Anton Rubinstein, who, having observed the excellent teaching taking place in institutions such as Leipzig, had decided to found a Russian conservatory. Since acquiring a charter to establish a new music society was banned under the regime, Rubinstein had to find a loophole in the system. His heart must have skipped a beat when he discovered that the charter for the Symphonic Society, established back in 1841 by our Count Wilhowsky, enabled him to reinstitute a society as the Russian Music Society in 1859. With the support from Grand Duchess Elina Pavlovna, she's here in the middle, and with the help of Duchess Elina Pavlovna, the Russian Music Society provided music education for Russians, by Russians, and established a nationalist school of music, which became increasingly important in the decades to follow. All of this history comes from that otherwise ignored dedication in Mendelssohn's score. The St. Petersburg Conservatory would have hardly been possible without the emotional and financial support of Grand Duchess Elena Pavlova to Anton Rubinstein. And as it turns out, she is a major figure who hardly features in our textbooks and not often considered in historical surveys. Institutional histories naturally provide opportunities to include a different story for the role of women in music. Nearly every conservatory has had influential women who were crucial to the founding and operation of their institutions. Many women of financial means, think Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, helped to establish important musical institutions and shaped much of music history. They are often left out of the grand narrative because they were not necessarily the ones making music, even though the impact that they had on new music and musicians in reality is inescapable and quite profound. Janet Thurber, most famous for bringing Dvorak to New York to seek out our American sound, pioneered an institution of music education. Founded in 1885, Thurber's National Conservatory of Music of America quickly became a source of envy for other institutions. By 1891, she had managed to have Congress incorporate her institution, a move that no other American conservatory had or has been able to accomplish. Thurber believed that a great nation should also have a nationalized music school equal in standing to the government-funded institutions in Europe. Although her plans were to have the US government fund her national conservatory, the incorporation was the furthest she could get Congress to agree in her dreams. Like many music institutions which came before hers, Thurber encouraged Native Americans, African Americans, and women to attend her conservatory. Despite the government's unwillingness to offer funds, Dvorak's famous observation that African American music and America's unique sound would not have been made without the uniquely diverse and perhaps most representative student body she assembled at her conservatory. Financial and artistic direction were not the only role women played in establishing centers of music education. Institutions around the world thrived because of performers such as Clara Schumann, Lilian Nordica, the championed singer from the New England Conservatory, and Koda Nobu from the Tokyo University of the Arts, who became one of Japan's first internationally renowned pianists. In fact, by the dawn of the 20th century, musicians freely traveled the world, seeking quality music education from renowned institutions. Western music had become global. A focus on institutional history also allowed for an exploration of the process of music globalization. As with many conservatories in the United States, the Boston Conservatory attracts many talented and accomplished musicians from Asia. Despite the fact that musicians from Asia have held a prominent place in Western music for over a century, it has been difficult to include their contributions and influence in a curriculum focused primarily on the Western canon. Moreover, it is sometimes forgotten that Asian musicians have embraced and adopted Western music as their own. To overlook their presence and contribution to music seems short-sighted, especially in a globalized musical tradition in which we live today. Because of the demographics of my international students, as well as my personal knowledge of Japan, I decided to incorporate the development of Asian conservatories into my syllabus. Perhaps to everyone's surprise, as students of the Boston Conservatory, we could begin a study of Asia from a local history. Together, my students and I studied the impact of Luther Mason's music curriculum. This is one of the images that he has, which was originally developed for the Boston public schools. The curriculum was more largely adopted by the Japanese government in the 1870s, when it was introduced to them through Mason's student, Isawa Shuji. The close and trusted relationship between the two men allowed them to form Japan's first music curriculum and the Tokyo Ongaku Daigaku, known today as Geidai, or the University of Arts. We also studied the foundation of 3 major Chinese conservatories, investigating the foundation of Shanghai Conservatory by Kai Yuanpei and Jiao Yumei, the more recently founded Central Conservatory of Beijing, and the brand new Juilliard School, which will be opening in Tianjin in 2018. But the point of my seminar was to have an opportunity to place the story of our local institution among the global narrative, to understand where the founding of the Boston Conservatory might fit into the history. The founding of the Boston Conservatory in 1867 coincided with a recovering nation's desire for peace after America's bloodiest war. Julius Eichberg's conservatory was progressive, providing opportunities for everyone to learn the music trade. Though success at the conservatory was relatively immediate, several events helped to establish Boston as the center of music education. The first Boston Peace Jubilee, held in 1869, was organized by military band leader Patrick Gilmore and gathered musicians to the city of Boston from around the nation for a major celebration. Musicians from every state in the nation sang in choruses of 10,000 and performed in orchestras of thousands. It was one of the greatest events of the region and brought a new sense of unity and desire for grandeur for years to come. For music education, the event became an important promotional tour to lure students to the Boston area conservatories. Embraced with this knowledge of the Boston Conservatory's founding, I organized a visit to the conservatory archives for my students to engage directly with this history. As they eagerly sought out the materials in different boxes, their excitement quickly shifted to confusion as it became disappointingly evident that certain documents had been preserved. And I was extremely pleased and also giggled when they said, "They're just all in boxes. We thought they would be behind vaults and fancy locks and everything." Well, they learned something. In the meantime, I was aware that my students would likely not have previous training in archival research. To equip them, I used chapters and articles on the history of conservatories we were already reading in class and asked them to engage more deeply with the literature, to develop and build an awareness of how historical texts are written. While gathering historical information from these readings, I asked my students to dig through the footnotes and bibliographies to compile lists and short summaries of the sources scholars had used to support their histories. They dutifully observed that newspapers, letters, photographs, and personal accounts were items that frequently supported the historical narratives that they were reading. Over the course of several weeks, my students had begun to notice that several authors were lacking in specific information. Years and even decades of information seemed to be missing from the stories. Although they had learned this by the time we arrived at the archive, they were really only able to appreciate why these gaps existed when they saw what they saw, or rather what they couldn't find, in the archives, and acknowledged for the first time the reality of historical research. Actually witnessing that historical documents are not always preserved changed the way my students interacted with music history. The lesson learned at the archive that day was something that beautifully written textbooks can never teach. It's my class. The final assignment for my students was to write a major paper on a topic which interested them personally, and I would like to close by sharing the results of their efforts. As you can see in your handout on the other side, the topics covered were wide-ranging. Several students chose to look at how their own instruments were represented in the history of conservatories, and many discovered that their favorite pedagogues trained at conservatories. Observing the place of women and seeking to find reasons why jazz and popular music from African American communities were excluded from many conservatories, other students sought to eradicate blind spots in history. Julie Winslow, who is studying for her master's degree in music education, was especially inspired by the archival research which took place during the semester. Although she had had very little prior training, she prepared a paper which examined the history of music education at the Boston Conservatory. Her data, which has never been systematically organized, revealed an impressively continuous history of the Boston Conservatory's training in music educators. Plans are currently in place to work together with her to prepare her research for publication. By nature, the history of institutions required creative sleuthing and different stories to create a new narrative. But it is our job as music educators to find a way to make music history come alive to our students. As an institution does not need to be 150 years old. All institutions have a past. Some may have a long-standing history of college bands. Some may have a deep connection with a local community orchestra. Others might be able to focus on the development of their music education curriculum, like Julie was inspired to do. Offering a chance for students to engage with different histories, including archival materials and local stories from their own institutions, fulfills Burkholder's exhortation to create new musical narratives based on interests relevant to our students today. The study of institutions and those who founded them, moved through them, altered them, and promoted them is inevitably a story of us and how we are significant to the history of Western music. Thank you.
What questions do you have for Elina?
This is not relevant to your main point, but kind of as a possible sideline. Did you talk about the Paris Conservatory at
Yes.
all? And how did they talk about the it's a completely different sort of mission for a conservatory than these
Yeah.
other models.
Well, originally when I thought about putting together this, I'm actually a medievalist by training, and so I wanted to start with Boethius and start with, you know, where does music start? Why do we even study music, and how we do all of this? And like I kind of alluded at the very beginning of the paper, I did have to cut certain things, so I wanted to do something more on the Italian conservatories and the orphanages and other things as well. So we did one session on Paris, and we looked at the different instrumentations or the instrument instructors that were from there, and that became like the first conservatory that they started off with, and then from there we moved on into. And I also was trying to look for ways to make the connection happen more carefully, which is why I decided to use Leipzig and the St. Petersburg to show, and Leipzig is also one of those institutions that everybody comes back to over and over again when you look at the history. So Paris, yes, was included in that, but it was kind of the foundation from which we went further.
Thank you. And to sort of follow up on that last question, I'm wondering about some thoughts about what we should understand the word conservatory to mean. And you mentioned the Italian conservatories. I vividly remember hearing a talk by Robert Yerdingen in which he spoke about the Naples Conservatory, and you know, he showed a picture from contemporary Naples with some sort of ragtag street urchins sitting on top of a roof somewhere, and he said if this were the 18th century, these would be the students at the conservatory.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you know, so conservatorio in that sense, you know, meant that what they were conserving was these people, and
Right.
I think we generally now understand conservatory to mean conserving musical tradition. Is that a fair understanding of what the word means in current language?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Yes, the other thing that I had to admit in this survey was schools of music and the development of schools of music in colleges, because that wasn't relevant to my students, even though a lot of them had come from schools of music to come here as for their graduate program. Again, I had to eliminate certain things to make a cohesive story so that they could feel how this history was put together. Yeah.
Then I follow up on that by telling my students, well, you know, you're studying at a conservatory, and a conservatory is by definition conservative.
Exactly.
Because that's what it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Did you collect any information on students' buy-in? Because it is a topic that relates to them. I'm particularly interested, I assume you've taught other graduate seminars on topics that are maybe of less immediate interest to the students.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you did any sort of comparison or collected feedback from them as you went along to figure out how much more engaged they were.
Well, this particular seminar, as you saw, there's only 12 students in the class. And so the way I designed it was I would give a roughly 30-minute lecture. And then I would assign each week for the students to prepare reading questions and discussion topics for themselves. And then so I would do half an hour of lecture with pictures and other things that basically gave us a framework for the evening, because this is an evening class. And then they actually interacted between themselves through discussions. So in that sense, they were very engaged with the material because they were forced to.
And more engaged than you'd seen in other seminars?
No, but I use this tactic in all of my graduate seminars when I teach them, that they have to come up with all the questions. So I would say it was about the same, but the archive really changed their perspective. That I was surprised how much they really changed. I was hoping they would, and they, completely had a different opinion. Mm-hmm.
That was a very interesting paper, thank you. I'm picking up on this question about conserving a tradition, and wondering whether you got to a discussion about curriculum that, and in schools of music and NASM accreditation and so on, that we are basically teaching a curriculum from the 19th century.
So we didn't talk about current curriculums as much, but we did look, especially, we compared the Liszt Academy in Weimar with some of the things that were happening in Leipzig as two separate different institutions, because Leipzig had more of this performance-free curriculum where actually music history suffered in the teaching. But then what happened up in Weimar was much more structured and organized. And so we did have throughout the course an understanding that there were different curriculums. But we didn't actually get into the modern curriculums as much because the whole point was more of a historical survey, which I could have included more of the modern discussion. But we did, in our discussion, it did come upon us, like how we were taught in different institutions, because I did have students from different places, and we did talk about, well, in my school we did this, and one of the things was, well, why didn't we learn more about jazz? And so that was one of the reasons why some of the students took up that paper as their topic, to see why, and they were surprised. Yeah.
So at the beginning, when you were talking about the hypothetical cellist with the Mendelssohn, it occurred to me that it's part of the same thing that you always hear where studio teachers supposedly don't want their students spending any time thinking about music history.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking that this is a good way also of potentially making your colleagues see why what you're doing
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
useful and relevant to them and why they,
Yeah.
so.
I mean, that's kind of I trained as a pianist, so that was me, basically. I would look at a dedication. I don't recognize the name. Why should I know anything more about it? Of course, now I appreciate it more. But yeah, it's a way to get them to
Did
think.
you have any conversations with the studio teachers and find out if they thought?
No, I didn't have a chance to do that. But
Be interesting
in the
to know if
future.
they thought it was useful. Or
yeah.
So I noticed you have an entire week devoted to archival research methods,
Yeah.
which I think is great. I just wanted to know, did all of these student papers involve archival research in some way? Okay. And,
No.
And could you talk maybe about how you structured, especially given the sort of wide range of different methods that different students would end up taking, and how you maybe structured and integrated the training of methods into the course?
So unfortunately, that was a snow day, so I had to get cut. But I did incorporate it into the different classes as I went through, because I believe this is really important. In the archival research methods lecture that I had prepared, I also have library. How do we use a library, what libraries are, what they include, what online databases are, all these different things. And then on top of that, I said, and by the way, libraries also often have archives. And so this is what we find in archives. I told them most things are in boxes. They didn't believe me until they went to the archive. It was more of a practical, how do we do research? What do we do with our, skills that we learn? Not from music, but because they're performers primarily, and so they don't really care that much most of the time until they get to see what we actually do as historians, and that really piqued their interest. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I'm just wondering, at this point about the dedications, did you have time to talk with them about how in the 19th century and before dedications were a matter of professional reciprocity? In other words, you had to ask permission, and it wasn't the sort of personal thing that we do now, but so did you guys talk about that?
We did talk about a lot of different 19th century practices. A lot of things, because this type of specific, this was actually much more than they could handle, even this level of history. And so when I would get into more of the political history and other things, they struggled a little bit with that. So I did supply them with other things. And the readings that we had, I just take from different chapters and articles that are available, and I compile my own reading material. And most of those also discuss these various different things in the articles themselves. And so that helped stem some of the conversation as well.
Well, thank you, Elina, and just a minute for a little technological reset.
Well, if we are, then I should go down here. Or you should go here. I should go here? Dan should go here.
We could mix it up.
Okay.